Good evening, good afternoon even, everybody. It's Sunday afternoon. I'm based at UK collector Stephen Josland's place. This is all part of Dusgate Arts Festival's summer of online activities where we're showing performances, talks, and the idea is to show you some of the art from the UK, from UK performers, UK collectors, etc., to give you a programme of art for this summer. It was supposed to be our festival year, but unfortunately, due to the obvious pandemic reasons, we had to withdraw from doing the live festival. But for this year, we have got these monthly talks on the 1st of every month, and we're running them until September is the last one. So this is the penultimate one. Next month's one is going to be sound artist Vicky Clark, and she does some beautiful electronic performance-based work. She'll be working also with Sean Clark, no relation, who works on the visuals as well as the actual presentation of the piece as well. So 1st of September, tune in for that one. There'll be more details on our website, and we'll be putting that out, promoting that across social media as well. But returning to the business of today, we have Stephen Josland, a UK collector of comics, Marvel comics in particular. And for this talk specifically, we're looking at the 1960s and the 1970s. The idea of looking at the art influences that actually influence the artist creating the work within, as well as the design of the comics, how they were laid out as much as the content within each of the panels for the stories. So with no further ado, I'll turn to Stephen, and I believe you have a really good example to kick us off of a particular character.
Right, well, thanks, Lucy. And we'll start off basically with a cover from the early 1960s showing the formative years of the artists at work. Here we have, this is Jack Kirby, who's famous for working with Stan Lee, and we're going to talk in particular in this instance with the Submariner. And as you can see, it's really quite straightforward. It's not that particularly muscular
as a character.
And from here, you know, eventually we get to him there. So what is the natural progression from the early covers to these covers at the late 60s, the development of the body, the character itself, and the artwork? So that is an example just to begin with. So very early on, we start off, the covers were really very, very simple. Here we have an early 1961 Strange Tales. You're seeing exactly what is in the comic. They're individual stories. Each one's got a square, and it's just telling you. There's nothing that exciting, nothing that detailed.
But it almost represents the inside of the comic.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like, you know, the very first page of the comic. There's another example here of Tales to Astonish, which is the early Ant-Man. Again, it's all in. You know, you just got very, very simple artwork, no backgrounds, telling you exactly what's happening. So it was not that exciting, but it was all novel because the superheroes, it's only just started coming out in the early 60s. So it was just a new beginning. The design-wise, there's an awful lot of words, banners, flashes. It's telling you exactly what is in there. Very reminiscent of the 1950s advertising. It was almost like the actual words were more important than the artwork at the time. So again, these were early 1960s, but it quickly developed. I mean,
quite flat as well in the actual drawing.
Yeah, there's two-dimensional, almost like cartoon cutouts. You know, it was fine. It was fine, but it was novel, and it was just the beginning. Then eventually, with more characters, you've got early Thor, Ant-Man, who became Giant Man by this time. Yeah, there's the Wasp, and then in the other corner is Iron Man. I mean, if you look at Iron Man's suit, nothing at all like what people, you know, with the Marvel films, there's Iron Man now. So that's the basic design of it at the time. So,
and in the middle, who's the character in the middle?
Oh, I don't know that one.
Hulk.
it looks like a scroll or so. It's the Hulk, but it's somebody pretending to be the Hulk. It's some evil character. And at the time, of course, the bad is always lost. The good guys always won. The bad is always lost. It was black and white.
And inside, were they pretty much the same, the drawings as well?
Yeah, I mean, it was all very, very similar to this. You know, the backgrounds, if I show you the backgrounds of an early Strange Town.
And this is within the comic themselves, the panels.
Yeah, the paneling.
Yeah.
All squares. Again, the backgrounds, it was solid colour, either white, blue, yellow, pink, no detailing apart from the characters they're talking about at the time. And each one, you know, loads of panels per page. It was just a very basic narrative there.
Very, very similar to the advertising that was inside as well.
But that did change very, very quickly once the artists were given more of a free range then to start developing their own designs and characters.
What year would that be roughly?
That was about 61 to 63. Okay. Then the first incidence of a popular art movement of the 60s, the pop art culture, Andy Warhol, Lichtenstein, worked its way into comics, and they started becoming very much more integrated with the characters, backgrounds, colour, much more detail. So we've got an early Fantastic Four there, Jack Kirby again,
the artist,
and Stan Lee, the writer. Of course, you know, you're beginning to develop the actual characters now, shape-wise, and there we got Submariner again. So he's already changed within 3 years from that chap there in the corner to that.
Quite a contrast.
Yeah. But the pop art movement was a very fun, youth-oriented movement, and it was quite lowbrow. Wasn't meant to be intellectual or anything. So it was mostly colour and shapes. And then we have early X-Men in the pop art series. Again, you can see how it's developed from these early ones, from that to that, you know, and that's in the space of 3 years. So,
quite dynamic shift, isn't it? In terms of the kind of reaching out, like for example on this one, the perspective on the family.
Yeah, that is very flat. That's very two-dimensional.
Yeah.
These now, the perspective is becoming more lifelike, much more like art itself, which was the drawings. There's another X-Men pop art series, and then it gradually got even more colourful and
very much more different, isn't it?
So this is beginning what was termed as the Silver Age of Marvel art. The stories were much more detailed, complicated, and more characters were introduced, but the art was much more realistic. So you're getting shadows, graduations, and musculature in the people's physiques now. So this is the pop art. And then, of course, it did reflect other things at the time. They incorporated the Beatles in the comics, going to cafes, listen to beatnik, jazz music. So it was much a social commentary of the time, as well as, you know, fantasy characters. Mm-hmm. Then that eventually changed even more so with the advent of other young artists coming onto the scene. There was two in particular in the mid-60s, Neil Adams and Jim Steranko, and they changed the way art looked in comics totally, because
wow, it's quite a difference, isn't it?
And it started to reflect the psychedelia movement at the time, when it was all flower power. A lot of it is hallucinatory with all these patterns and colours, and I suppose it's a bit tied in with the drug culture of the time, with popular music, mm-hmm. The way things have been moving on. Yeah. So, you know, so they started to develop, and this is Neil Adams. He was famous for the first run of his X-Men, but the one who took it to either greater extremes was Jim Steranko, and that is a superb example of the movement at the time. The figures, if you can see, the costumes became much more skin tight. The musculature was much more exaggerated and slightly distorted. They exaggerated movement, features, and colour.
Mm-hmm. Much, in a way, more similar to what we're more aware of now, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, what we see here now with the actual characters themselves, we can associate with Marvel films today. You know, they haven't changed that much. They've reached the apogee of their size around about the mid 60s, early 60s, 768. These are more classic Steranko covers.
And that's quite bold in it.
It's very graphic, you know. So again, if you can compare just a few years previous with that to that, it's worlds apart. You know, they really have come on and developed their own method of drawing.
Is that the first or second edition of Captain America? I think you said, is it?
Well, Captain America first appeared in the 1940s in Marvel Comics, but he was fighting the Nazis. He was fighting Hitler and the Nazis. Yeah. But the idea of superheroes with villains and characters and fantasy style came in the 60s, like with Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. Then Steranko continued. I mean, that is pure swinging London 60s, isn't it? With its patterns, colours, absolutely brilliant.
It's gorgeous, isn't it?
Yeah. And another one with the colours. I mean, so Steranko was extremely influential.
And these are all American based. Was that where the movements and changes?
Oh yeah, it was all yeah. I mean, pop art actually originated in the UK as a style with youth, but it became part of the American youth culture, and they took it to the next step. They took it to the extreme of colour and design. It was quite a shortish movement. Because eventually, with the colours, design, and that, as often happens with art movements, there's a reaction, and it became much more controlled, much more stylised, mannered. And at the time, in the late 60s, we were starting to see in album covers from progressive rock like Yes, Genesis, and their album covers were very much based on the rediscovery of the Romantic movement, the pre-Raphaelites, and anything to do with nature. So it became very much a more stylized version.
So all of these art influences are going right through popular culture, including into the comic.
Oh yeah, series. Yeah. I mean, obviously, because the artists at the time, they were young, so they were, you know, they're immersed in these cultures from every day. And being an artist, they were aware of what was going on, and getting a job in Marvel Comics was absolutely brilliant. But then you get what I class as the classic Marvel age of romanticized covers. And here we've got Silver Surfer and Thor by John Buscema. You know,
the artist John Buscema did this. Yeah.
Now this is you know, regarded as one of the best Marvel Comics covers of its time.
And what in good mint condition? What is a comic like that worth?
In very fine mint condition, you're talking, you know, £1,000, £2,000 now. Yeah. If it's graded professionally, then that, you know, is even more. But when it's on its own like this, that's termed as a raw comic. But when it's in one of these, it's a graded comic, and this is graded by CGC, which is an American company. Only started in the year 2000, but this is for collectors. Collectors go for these because you can't open these, you can't read these, So whenever it's graded, it's guaranteed. So therefore, the price is kept, for value, and collectors keep these and they put them away. They don't read these ones.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and to get a comic graded, you send it to...
Yeah, you can either send it directly to CGC itself, or you do have agents in the UK that you can talk to, and then they will send it in a block with other people's comics, and it's cheaper. It does take months to come back because so many people now, because of the value of comics, they're sending them all in to be graded.
So we've gone from the psychedelia.
Yeah, so we moved. So it was
the
romantic movement, where it was more now. Art was just predominantly on the characters. There is apart from the title of the comic, there's nothing else on that to distract from the artwork itself. The difference from the early ones where it was covered in words. Mm-hmm. It's got words absolutely everywhere, and then you've got that. So now the art was the most important thing. The stories were good, but it was the art. People were buying these for the art now, because these artists then became very, very famous. And there's another John Buscema there, another famous cover.
Beautiful orange as well.
The very first Vision. But look at, just simple. It's monochrome, but in just the red, and just beautiful proportions, design, and perspective. Lovely cover. Mm-hmm. So then after that stayed for a couple of years. This was the norm for most of the Marvel comics of the time. Then come along a young British artist.
Yeah.
Oh, hang on, before we get to that, I will show you the inside. I was talking about the internal design of the panels. Now here we have, this is a Jim Colan artist, Doctor Strange, and if we look at the design of the panels, totally changed from the squares. The most important thing here is it was flexible, and you could just literally use your imagination as an artist to draw.
It gives an extra dynamic nature to the way you read.
Yeah.
As well, I imagine.
Yeah. So, comics now were works of art. They weren't just basic to be read and then thrown away. These were started to be collected now by collectors purely because of the artwork involved.
And the year of that one, for example, roughly is
68, 69.
68, 69.
Then in 1970 came along a young British artist, Barry Smith, and he changed the way comics art was drawn again. This is his very first Conan. This is the peak Barry Smith. He did do a few earlier comics for the Daredevil and a few Avengers, but he was copying mostly Jack Kirby's style. And then his hero was the Pre-Raphaelites, Burne Jones in particular. So here we have the detailing that you get in the Pre-Raphaelite drawings, everything from grass to trees and things, and internal artwork.
Much more detail. When we think about the early ones you were shown, there's hardly anything or nothing.
I mean, Barry Smith was notorious for taking his time in drawing, and he often missed deadlines. So he didn't do an awful lot for Marvel because he found it just the actual work involved was because he used to do the inking himself as well. And
how much of those artists at that time, because we think of the computer generated things now, a whole studios full of people, how much at that time was it multiple people working, or was it just single artists?
I mean, these artists would be doing these at home, mostly at home. There wasn't an office or anything. They would do it in their own studios, and they would do it in pencil. It would be sent into the Marvel offices. Then they would have an inker that would go over the artist's drawings in ink, and then it would be coloured on an acetate, overlaying that. So when it was sent to the printers, what you see is what you know, as a printed book, but it was all in layers. It was all done individually. Nowadays on computer, it's all done on top of each other. So there was an awful lot of work involved in producing a comic at this time, and that's why a lot of the deadlines were missed. So there you got Barry Smith, and absolutely beautiful detailing. And again, that's the Barry Smith Conan is classed as one of the highlights of Marvel's comics of the Silver Age.
And was it unusual to have a British artist?
Yeah, very. He actually went to America on his own volition and bagged an interview with Stan Lee and said, I want to draw for you. Gave a couple of his artworks and went from there. He lived in Sydenham, I believe, or Croydon, one of the two.
Okay, yeah.
And this is Barry Smith's last Conan, Song of Sonia, of Red Sonja.
Incredibly busy.
Yeah, very, very busy. So, you know, absolutely lovely. But he didn't do much more after that because the workload involved was just too much.
Yeah. And that year of that one?
72, I believe.
So just tipping into the 70s now.
Yeah. Because, this is early 70s. And then at the same time as this, because it sort of slightly leads on the romanticised version of the art, we come to, with the Doctor Strange, he did an awful lot of this mysticism that was big at the time. So they could really use their own imagination in this sort of thing. But also coming big was the, not science fiction as such, but it was called the cosmic movement. And this is where they deities of and gods and all sorts of things.
What inspired this?
It was I suppose with the moon landing and all of that. And then people started thinking on a wider, our place in the universe. And so it wasn't the science fiction of old, it was the science fiction that we associate now, when it was star travel, aliens, demigods, concepts of time, infinity, things like that. So one artist at the time, another one that was very influential was Jim Starlin. He first went on Captain Marvel. The Captain Marvel had been around for some time, but he was just a Cree doing his space travel and getting into all sorts of typical superhero
lots
fights.
Of detail.
But
again,
now, Jim Starlin was very, very big on concepts of space and time, and it was become very. Another one of his was Warlock, and if you look at his designs again, it was followed on from Barry Smith with the detailing, but it's all in space now. It's all very.
Let's hold that right up there so
Yeah.
we can have a good look.
That's the origin of Warlock. Warlock originally appeared in Fantastic Four as him, but he became known as Adam Warlock in his own comic in the early 70s. See, again, the detailing.
This page here as well, artistically, it's quite a different thing, isn't it? There's sort of long strips as well.
Yeah. Again,
Completely
very, very different. Very different. But Jim Starlin, he was the creator of Thanos, which we all know from the Avengers films.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Avengers, Marvel has become its huge own franchise in its own way now, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many Marvel films that are going to come out from all of these comics. It could go on for decades because they're just not going to run out of concepts. And
as a collector, do you look for what might be the next character, or hear about what might be?
For investment purposes, you tend to keep your ear to the ground, find out what Marvel are going to produce in a film or on television. Lots of the characters are secondary. They're not that important, but people jump on the bandwagon and think, oh, that's going to be worth a lot of money, only for it to drop again. It's the main characters, like Doctor Strange, Thor. They go right the way through with in different comics, in different storylines. They're the origin of all these characters are much more important. They're the ones that collectors go for,
and they're the ones you keep in a secure, separate.
Oh yeah, I mean, I keep all of my comics in metal cabinets, and they're all in a secure lockup. So that way, it's fireproof, floodproof, because it takes years to get all of these together, and the last thing you want is for damage to happen. So it's always best to keep them in
specific storage.
Yeah, it's bag and boarded. You put them in these plastic bags with a board at the back, and then you can either put them in harder plastic casing just to give it extra protection. So there we got the cosmic phase in the early 70s.
And after that, where did it move?
Well, it then became mainstream. Everything from Jim Starlin from the early 70s became mainstream. So then it went into every other comic. So you found the Avengers going into space, Fantastic Four fighting space aliens and things. Doctor Strange went the other way. Rather than going out into space, he went into different universes, and that is a wonderful Frank Bruner art of Doctor Strange. Wow. Yeah, I mean, that is super. So again, when you look at that from the early 60s.
Wow, this one up here.
And then in just over 10 years, you get that.
Yeah.
I mean,
wow.
Now people were collecting artists, not just the titles of the comics, but they were collecting the artists that actually drew in them. So Neil Adams, again, he didn't do an awful lot for Marvel, but what he did, a few X-Men, some of the Avengers and things, but they are the ones that you want to go for if you can. But they are beautiful. So this sort of storyline went on till the mid 70s, late 70s. And then there was another change. Artists became, it became a little bit repetitive. You kept on doing the same thing. So all of a sudden you had a new influx of artists, and it changed again. It went more dark. It went more gritty. It went sort of what things you would associate with everyday life. With it was
a bit of realism.
A bit of realism. Like it dealt with drugs. It dealt with racism. It dealt with things that we all deal with today. So it pulled away a bit from the outlandish fantasy bit of the previous ones, and it stuck to what happens here and now.
Social, everyday.
Yeah, it was more social.
Yeah.
And one of those was Frank Miller, who did a run on Daredevil from the late 70s, and he's accredited with some of the very, very dark storylines. There we have Elektra. And again, you can't get any more pared down of a cover than that. It's almost going back to the origins of the 60s, but just with it's telling you the story, but in a totally different way. It deals with mental health issues and things. And here we have a great one with Bullseye and the Black Widow. So
the Black Widow from the latest film.
Yeah, and Natasha. So she was a big sidekick with Daredevil.
And how did she come in as a character? Because when we see her in the modern day film of Black Widow, she comes in as somebody who's been trained. They've tried to brainwash her.
She was trained as a secret agent from the Russians, primarily as the femme fatale, to infiltrate, to get secrets and things. She didn't have any special powers or anything apart from the allure of who she was. Eventually, she became much more dynamic in she did eventually get to, because she trained with the Avengers, she did change from being on the Russian side to the Avengers. So she did actually become quite an important character in her own right.
And there she is.
Yeah.
Is that one of her first appearances?
No. The first appearance was in it was actually in Tales of Suspense, but she was early Avengers. She joined because she was dating Hawkeye, who's from the Barton from the Avengers, and then from there she went and she had a fling with Daredevil. She was in Daredevil for quite some time, but of course you always get, she changes her mind. So she, in this one, I mean, I will show you the artwork for
That's very
Frank
dynamic,
Miller, because it's
beautiful. The artist is Frank Miller.
Frank Miller, yeah. And as you can see, there she is, Natasha. And the art becomes very, very dark, very moody.
And this is our contemporary Black Widow more that we know.
This is the Black Widow that you would recognise on the screen. She becomes, she is an assassin by this time.
Does she become a hero, anti-hero?
She wants to be a hero, but she's too, because she's still aware of what she's done in the past. So she desperately wants to be accepted, but.
And in terms of art and content, what is influencing this style then? Is it the social political change that's coming out?
In the 80s, it wasn't a particularly optimistic time, was it, in the world? And it was all about the Cold War, nuclear armament, that sort of thing. And it was all about internal struggles. It was all very, very dark.
I'll hold that cover up so people can look.
Yeah.
There we go. Black Widow. Right. And so from there...
Well, from there, see, art started to change again because computers were coming in and artists were using the computers more to actually do the artwork itself. So it became less artistic in a way. It didn't look like what comics used. The colours changed, became harsher. It just didn't have the same feel as the artists like Jim Starlin and Neil Adams, but they would take days just drawing and inking the things. It was totally different now with computer. It was all more airbrushed. It was all softer. It was all exaggerated. By this time, the physiques of the bodies were enormous.
Do you have any of those?
No, I don't,
examples?
because I stopped at the end of the Frank Miller ones because to me it just didn't relate to the comics that I grew up in. Yeah. So,
and as a collector, presumably you have these kind of genres and different periods in the comics iterations where you go, well, this is the period I'm going to collect.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you usually collect. If you don't know the artist, then then you go for the character, and then by building up a collection of the character, you know some artists have a complete run through the book. And others only do a short one, and you can compare the artists. Think, I like that chap or that lady, and then sometimes you go specifically to collect the artist himself, like with Neil Adams, because things like John Buscema. I mean, he actually did. Because there's another one of his. He actually did hundreds and hundreds of comics He did Avengers, Submariner, he had a run on the Fantastic Four, he did all of Conan's after Barry Smith left. So, they're not scarce. But the likes of Barry Smith, you've only got 24 Conans, and of course some of those were reprints because he missed his deadlines. The same amount of Neil Adams for Marvel. So they're much more easy to collect because you can just go and get all of them. Jim Starlin, again, did a number of Captain Marvel and Warlock with Jim Starlin. Did occasional Daredevil and fillers, an Iron Man or something, but he's mostly, these are his famous ones that people collect.
And how did you get into collecting?
Well, I mean, I remember collecting them, reading them when I was a kid, the first time around when they first came out in the early 60s. Of course, at the time, you don't think about collecting them. You just put them in your back pocket, put them under the bed, and they get thrown away. Then, when I was about 15, 16, I started to collect them again when I was at school, properly. We used to go to comic marts and things. And then, I think it was in the 80s, I sold them all because, you think, I should grow up. But, and then all of a sudden you get to that age, you think, I really miss those comics. So you start buying them all again, and then you realise how much they're worth, and how much they cost. But I enjoy them now for nostalgic reasons, the art reasons, and of course the Marvel films. And that brings an awful lot of new people into the market. So there's comics for every pocket, really. You've got some that are very reasonably priced, and others key issues, first appearances of people like Doctor Doom or whatever. Then they cost a fortune.
We've got a question from Rav Shaw here saying, to what extent does the artist stroke illustrator choose how to design the superheroes look? For example, creating the X-Men, the costumes, or is it based mostly on the author's vision, who actually writes?
Right, well, the costumes, they're more or less set in stone, unless it's agreed with the editor and the authors. Doesn't matter what the artist is. If the X-Men, have we got any X-Men?
Which one have we got? That one, yeah.
Yeah, that's Wolverine over there. Yeah, so there's the early X-Men, and this is their black and white black and yellow costumes very early on. But a bit later on, they decided that they weren't grand enough, so they would change them. And once they've been designed, they had to keep, whoever drew them kept that style of costume, whatever comic they appeared in. If they would cross over with Avengers, cross over with Fantastic Four, the artist who was drawing that comic at the time had to follow the set design of the costume, and the same how the people looked. So there was a continuity amongst all of the comics. So, but a change in costume or a change in the appearance would only be agreed with, Stan Lee or the writer Roy Thomas or Marv Wolfman, whoever was writing, Chris Claremont, who was ever writing the comic at the time. But it had to be, the artist could not just do it, on his own. It all had to go through the usual committee stage.
And yet we see some of these are also socially changed, as we said right at the start of this, about the idea of
the physique of them.
Yeah, large pants.
Well, well, that was the comic code, because the comic code at the time, there were comics for children. They weren't allowed to show any sexual content at all, and that included any physical attributes that could be acute of being of a sexualized nature. It did become loosened a bit later on, where you could actually get more shape, especially with the females. Otherwise, it was the classic. The only way you could determine a female from a male in the early comics was she had a slim waist. Otherwise, she was flat-chested and exactly the same. But later on, they did relax the comic code. And
well, something like Daredevil is a good.
Yeah, I mean, by this time,
there's Black Widow.
Yeah, you could see, all sorts of physical attributes which you couldn't see before.
Right, lovely, super. I hope that answers your question, Ralph. Anybody else who does have any questions, please feel free to ask. We're taking questions as we go into the last 5 minutes of the talk. Out of these characters, we're looking at the 60s, 1960s and 1970s. Which ones, first, did you feel were most influenced by the art changes, and which ones are your favourites?
Right. Well, my favourite is always one of my favourites. Always been Silver Surfer, primarily because he just didn't appear that often. He first appeared in Fantastic Four 48 in a trilogy with Galactus, which is going to be the big new villain in the next phase of Marvel films. Yeah, so Silver Surfer, first drawn by Jack Kirby and written by Stan Lee. So they were the creators of him. This is when Silver Surfer got its own comic, but there was only 18 of those. For some other reason, although he was very popular, it just didn't sell. So they stopped producing those. He did appear in various other comics, but not very often. But of course, he now is going to be a big character. So he's always been one of my favourites. I've always liked Doctor Strange. Although the Jim Cohen ones are classic, I actually do like the early Steve Ditko ones, the comic, the pop art phase, because different dimensions. He was the one that started all these peculiar, weird. I don't know if you saw the Doctor Strange movie, but yes, that is based basically on Steve Ditko's designs on the background, and they're just brilliant. I love those.
Is that the Cumberbatch ones?
Yeah. As a group, Fantastic Four were always my favourite group, because I think it's because these are the ones that I remember as a child. With that one there with the Inhumans, it's just to me it just sums up what the Fantastic Four is all about. And this is Jack Kirby at his best. There was a run from this one from the first Inhumans, then a few later on it was the Silver Surfer and Galactus, then came Black Panther. So all these characters are so big, and they all came out within a year. This was the height of their creativity. And these ones I always remember as a kid. And these were some of the first ones I rebought when I started to collect them again.
Great. Well, I think on that note, that's a good point to wrap up with your favourites.
Oh, right.
Unless there's any.
No, I could go on, actually.
You can talk forever.
They're all favourites.
You have an extensive collection. As we said, you have to keep them in a very particular conditions. They're kept in locked storage. You do send them off to be graded, some of them, like many collectors. And there seems to be a very vibrant, multi-generational collective.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it goes from the young, pre-teens,
men, women,
to people older than me. It's totally intergenerational, and a lot of women are getting into it now, because before it was definitely in the 60s. It was definitely a boys' thing. There wasn't any, apart from Mari Severin, there weren't that many female illustrators or people working. They might have been working as colorists.
Yeah.
But they weren't seen as being experienced enough to actually take over. But Mari Severin did. She took over Submariner, John Buscema, and she was very good.
Limited opportunities, probably.
Yeah, and the same with female characters. Sue Storm in Fantastic Four, Jean Grey in, where is she? In X-Men, and Wasp in Ant-Man. There wasn't that many, but then there was Scarlet Witch. She came out. Black Widow. I think they cottoned on to the fact that a lot of young girls actually wanted to get into comics. They liked them, so they introduced all these other characters just to make it more
appeal.
Yeah, more appeal. And now, they're with Marvel films, I mean, Captain Marvel now is actually a woman, which did happen in the comics. So Carol Danvers, she took the place of Marvel himself. So they're very true. The actual films are very true to the comics. They might not stick to the same era, but they do actually stick to the stories in the comics that have gone through the decades. So older collectors like myself can recognise the storylines and everything in the films, and you're sitting there watching and think, I know where that, I remember what comic that bit came from. It's very clever, and they overlap and they interweave, and it's so thought out. It's very, 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 very clever.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'd like to thank, in terms of this talk today that's been presented by Stephen, he's done a fantastic job of showing me, really, as well as you, hopefully, some of those art influences. It's good to know as well some of those stories are being brought out and characters as we go forward with the Marvel films, the ones that are more contemporary. Next month's art event will be on the 1st of September. We've got sound artist Vicky Clark performing for us live, so that'll be a wonderful performance to come along to, listen to. Again, it's free online, so we really encourage you to come along to these and support the artists that are coming. And I suppose finally, just to thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Been really good.
It's nice to be able to show off comics, actually, and talk about them.
And thank you to all of you at home. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.